Mr. Speaker, National won't be supporting this bill. Thank you.
David Cleandon.
Tēnā koe, Mr. Speaker. Ngā mihi o te ahi ahi ki a koutou. Mr. Speaker, I'm pleased to take a call to speak to this bill and indeed to speak in support of what we believe is a useful and still a very necessary bill, despite the protestations of the government speakers so far. The Greens are not always persuaded that it's a good idea to resort to a legislative solution from a one-off event or one-off problem. Often you simply end up with the sound of stable doors slamming. You end up with legislation which is unnecessary, something which is trying to deal with a problem that's already passed. But as Mr. Cheval has already articulated, this is still a very live problem. The mischief that this bill seeks to remedy, to resolve, is still very much a live possibility that we could once again see something along the lines of the ING, ANZ issue, the event. There's a very real possibility that the very uneven distribution of power could put us in a situation again where the well-being, the investment of large numbers of small investors are at risk, and where those people are effectively obliged to gamble on what might be the outcome of a deal essentially being offered to them by a bank, by an insurance company, by whatever the organisation may be. We ought not to be having to argue for the principle of avoiding a situation where people or organisations can contract out of their legal responsibilities. That principle, you would think, would be generally acknowledged. We see it in the Consumer Guarantees Act, where people cannot contract out, or rather suppliers cannot contract out of their obligations to consumers. Different situation with trade relationships, clearly. But the key principle is that people cannot be obliged, or even if they think they have contracted out, that there is a legal protection to avoid that happening. We see it in Consumer Guarantees Act, as I've said. We see the references to it in Fair Trading Act. Things like the extension of that being the unfortunate practice of people being persuaded to buy these quite valueless extended warranties, for example. There is a well-embedded legal principle of not allowing people to contract out of responsibility. And effectively that is all this bill seeks to do, to make a very minor amendment, albeit a significant one, to a piece of legislation, so that people are no longer, as I say, at some future time, put in a position where they might have to second guess whether taking the deal that is currently on the table will leave them better or worse off than waiting for some legal process, some regulatory process to work its way through and come to some sort of a resolution. Clearly that statement would be opposed by those who might be on the other side of that equation. And I was interested to note a newspaper article in the ODT from the time when this bill was first presented. A gentleman from the ANZ, the Manager Director of Private Banking and Wealth, splendid title, was concerned about the so-called retrospective nature of this bill. He said it might create uncertainty for business if regulatory and legal requirements could be subject to change. He said that under the bill there would be no incentive for parties to agree to out-of-court settlements because agreements to settle disputes would never be full and final. All very well, but rather overlooks the fact that this situation only occurred in a case of what was at best gross negligence, and in fact, as was described earlier, was the failure of the company entrusted with people's investments to operate to an appropriate legal or indeed an ethical standard. The best protection against companies holding investment, against being taken to task and this sort of thing, is simply to act legally, responsibly and ethically in these cases. The notion that this would somehow disadvantage the large corporate organisations is simply laughable, in fact. The Frozen Funds organisation, movement if you like, was commented on, and I think their website has some interesting and useful information, and I do think that the campaign quite rightly states on their website, which is now effectively an historic item, it says the campaign shows what a small group of committed people can achieve. And I do think that passing this legislation would be something of a legacy to that small group of people who did stand up for their rights, who worked very hard and fought very hard to get reasonable outcome out of the situation. And we do support this bill and would encourage others to do so. Kia ora.
Mark Mitchell.
Thank you, Mr.